Hi, I'm Suze Shaner with Sage Leadership Strategies, and I'm your host today of Community Forum. And I have the great pleasure to have with me Todd Holzman, the CEO of Holzman Leadership Company. Welcome, Todd.
Hi, Suze. Good to see you.
Good to see you too. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Our viewers know that you and I go back a long way, maybe over a couple decades there, but who's counting from our days at IBM.
Right.
So can you give our viewers, today we're going to talk about candid conversations, but before we do, can you give our viewers an overview of your background and how you came to this work? I know how passionate you are about it.
Okay. So I guess the least embarrassing part is I've been spending the better part of 3 decades developing some 30,000 leaders globally in business and in politics, when I taught leadership at the Kennedy School of Government, to help them get to candor, learn how to have candid conversations with each other and anyone for that matter around the real issues. So I have a global faculty who does this work around the world. I guess the embarrassing bit is probably the reason I got into it is just because of how bad I was at it. In my early 20s, I thought I was God's gift to leadership. I'd been through a lot of leadership training, negotiation training, communication training, all kinds of things. And my first job, my first business that I started out of school, I found at a certain point I was not able to get people to see reason, despite how convincing I thought I was. So that led me on a quest to figure out how to do this a lot better.
Well, it's interesting because we know you can have the great rationale in the world, but if there's an emotional component, people may not see your reasoning, right? I mean, I'm curious. Yeah. So when you get out of school, it sounds like you were one of those annoying, smart people who who thought you had all the answers but couldn't really influence people. So tell us a little bit about your journey, and then I want to get into your current work, but your journey in terms of how did you get more, we'll say, proficient in how you were navigating conversations?
I guess it first started with just being frustrated about my own ability to have conversations with people, honest conversations with people, candid conversations with them. And it felt like it was either one of two things happened. I would avoid them because I was worried there'd be some big conflict. And then I would have to be really angry with myself for my cowardice. And then sometimes I would then talk about the real issues, then people will get upset and defensive. So I always felt like I was in this honesty dilemma. And so part of the big reason I went to grad school was to figure out a way out of it. And then in one of my classes there, so a mentor, since I was in my early 20s, one of my mentors is Dr. Victoria Marsick, who's the chair of the adult learning department at Columbia University. It was one of her classes that I realized the reason I wasn't good at it was because of me, not all of these unreasonable people.
So that's so interesting. So that's actually the reason why you went to graduate school, was to try to learn how to better navigate conversations and better influence people. And you discovered that you were part of the problem. That's a hard thing to look at when you have to look at yourself. How did that play out?
Oh, it was very surprising. Because I prided myself in being articulate, and convincing and often thinking I'm right.
That's interesting, because I would think being really smart, as I know you are, and obviously you thought you were. I would think, right?
Yeah,
I think that would be a barrier. That could really be a barrier. The smarter you think you are, that could be a barrier to learning, couldn't it be? I mean,
and probably one of the biggest influences on me in my life and my work is an amazing guy named Chris Argyris from Harvard, passed away about 6 or 7 years ago. He's kind of the Einstein of the organizational sciences. And he wrote a great article called teaching smart people how to learn, and how smart people often have like perfect defenses to learning. I guess I just cared more about doing good and the truth than, I guess, my own ego, and thankfully, I don't know, those drives won out over my desire to look good and be right.
So the desire to get at the truth.
Yeah,
And
more than anything.
unfortunately, in current times, we've seen painfully so that
Right.
having integrity and being a truthful leader can be a little wanting these days.
Yeah,
What
and
would you say to
it's
that?
yeah, and it's no surprise. So so first of all, I guess the ability to get to candor, maybe I could step back a little bit. Like, why have I been obsessed with that? I mean, why does somebody like me spend almost 3 decades obsessed about that?
Yeah,
I think first of all, I think it's very relevant now. We can't solve any problem we can't talk about. And often the best conversations are when we disagree with each other and we have legitimate but very different perspectives on things. And as a species, we're pretty bad at talking to each other when we disagree with each other, when we have differing agendas, when we have different value systems. This is, I mean, what we're seeing in our society, in American society, and civil unrest is people fundamentally on a kind of macro scale, people inability to talk to each other and to listen to each other. And and given how much more volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous everything is, nobody's got a monopoly on the truth, left or right. And I'm not going to really talk a lot about politics because I think my strength is more in the business world. Nobody's got a monopoly on the truth, and we have to do a better job out of courageously expressing ourselves, but also being a lot more compassionate and understanding, um, you know, of each other. And the only way we're going to be able to solve the complex problems that exist in the world is by working together to solve them. And being able to talk to each other across our differences is critical to being able to do that. And again, as a species, we've never done that well.
yeah, and it seems like, to your point today, we actually, if I could say, are in a crisis of how to have these conversations, whether you're looking in the political arena or the business arena. And the more complex the
Sure.
challenge, the more the need for that. What would you say keeps people from saying what is really on their mind?
Hmm. Probably a couple things. One, I think just fear, honestly. So I've had the privilege of people sending me and documenting for me tens of thousands of conversations where they didn't get the result that they wanted. And what you see is that there's a lot of good stuff they're thinking and feeling that they know that they don't say at all. Like, they really self-censor, or they struggle to say well. And 9 times out of 10, it's just because they're afraid if they say this thing that's on their mind, it's going to make things worse. It's going to prevent them from achieving some important objective. It's going to hurt a relationship. It's going to hurt their image. So, of course, they avoid it. So, I think there's just a huge fear that is driving people to avoid having these conversations instead of getting to candor when they need to. I think the other reason, when you look at all the data, is that, and my experience of developing all these people and doing research on why they struggle and what it takes to help them do better, is they don't realize, this may sound a little corny, but the cost of omission is greater than the consequences of commission. So there are all these things they're trying to protect, right? Their objectives, the relationships, their image. But by not being more candid, what they don't realize is how much damage they're doing to all of those things. In fact, the very avoidance of the candid conversation is hurting their ability to meet their objectives, preserve and deepen precious relationships, and to present the best image to the world that they want to.
Yeah, so fear can be, in a sense, a great motivator. So you're saying either people don't bring it up, or they bring it up in a way that also causes damage. What helps people say what's on their mind? First, say what's on their mind, and secondly, do so in a skillful manner.
I mean, I think the first thing is that people have to. So this is about a change in mindset and behavior for a lot of people, for probably most people, right? To be able to be candid and to do it competently. So the first thing is that they have to go through. They have to recognize that there's a huge gap in their ability to do so. That they're not doing it, and that when they do it, things don't necessarily go well. And most people have tremendous blind spots around that. So that's the first thing, because you have to create that motivation. Because for people to be able to do this and do this well, if they don't recognize that they don't recognize that they're part of the problem, kind of like I did when I was 24, it's not just a bunch of superficial techniques you can layer onto the way you currently think and behave. So that's number one. But then you better put things in their hands that actually work.
Yeah.
And not some theories that just sound good but have been developed by some consultants or some brilliant academics. And so I'm not the only person in the world, and we're not the only people in the world who kind of care about this, right? You've had like really solid books written about this particular topic. Difficult Conversations, great book. Radical Candor, another great book. Crucial Conversation, another great book. But what I've noticed is missing from people who've read those books, have gone through training that's often quite extensive, and they still struggle to be candid and to do so competently when they're under pressure. So my whole orientation has been, how do we make this very practical and put stuff in people's hands that's usable and develop them in such a way so that when we're under pressure, they can produce a candid conversation that's really effective. And there are kind of, I think, at a very high level, 4 things that people got to get right. They got to talk about the right issue. They got to talk about the right issue to the right people. They got to do it in the right way, and they have to do it in the right context. And
that's a lot to get right.
But it's a lot of, it is a lot to get right. I think that's true. Right issue, right people, right way, in the right context. And 80% of the time, when you look at these conversational breakdowns that people have submitted to me, 90% of which been in the kind of corporate world, right? Some of which were from world leaders at the Kennedy School of Government that I developed. 80% of the time, they've actually misdiagnosed what the real issue is. So they may be talking about it effectively, but they're talking about the wrong thing. So it's far better, in my mind, to talk about the right thing in the wrong way than the wrong thing in the right way. So that's the first thing, is help them get some mental clarity, like what's even worth talking about. People often misdiagnose that. People often talk to people with whom they feel safer, which is great. But sometimes the person you really need to engage about some problem inside of an organization is not the person you feel comfortable with, but is the person who's most relevant to confronting and dealing with that issue. Like, particularly when you're trying to influence and lead people beyond your authority. When it's somebody on your team, you want to give them performance feedback or some coaching, it's pretty straightforward. You know who that person is. And then the next thing is, doing it in the right way. And
hey, Todd, can we pause there on that?
Yeah, please.
The first one, because every one of these, getting it right, has some challenges and nuances to it. So, for example,
right.
Very understandable. People, especially the higher the stakes and the more the fears at play, or more that somebody has to look competent, or they have to influence somebody, or
Right.
they're under a really tight deadline, or they have a really complex issue, the stakes get higher. And so natural that somebody would rather talk to somebody safer, even if they're not the right person. So like, how do you
Exactly.
fortify somebody to feel okay, or to come up against their own fear, the emotional reaction of wanting to talk to Jane when they should be talking to Judy or John and Joe, you know? How do you, yeah,
Well, first of all, I think it starts with them recognizing that there are already consequences of their avoidance, right? So
yeah,
if they're not having the candid conversation, the first step is for them to recognize that. So they're very motivated to do something about it. But to your point, it doesn't mean they're still not, they're still afraid
yeah,
of having the conversation. And what I find is if you take people through a process of thinking through what is the valuable thing to talk about, like what should I talk about? And you help them get clarity on that. If you help them figure out who they need to talk to and how to frame it so that the person they're talking to will really care about what they're talking about, even that, even before opening their mouth, even before working on any technique, that gives them a lot of confidence that they first of all, they have the right to talk about this thing, and they feel like, wow, I have a way to help the person I want to talk to connect with what I'm saying, so it becomes a lot less scary.
well, yeah, and it
That makes
also
any
has,
sense.
yeah, yeah, I know, I understand what you're saying, and it also becomes, they have to make sure that they're focusing on what that person cares about. And oftentimes, if we're you know, in our own shoes, looking out the window, we're just seeing what we see, and we don't kind of go sit next to that person and see what they're seeing. So
Right,
what really what you're saying is, once they have the motivation and the clarity, like, yeah, I need to get better at this, then it's like, okay, you got to get out of your own mind a little bit and see, why
right,
should the person want to talk to you? What would they care about?
right. And so, just maybe an example would be helpful here. So, I was working with a head of HR at a large, well-known bank, and what she saw was a lot of dysfunction on a particular leadership team. That she was the HR business partner to the head of that leadership team, and you know, she had enough data to show that there was just like a bunch of infighting on the team. So she tried to convince the uh, the CEO running this team that, hey, let's go to an offsite and work on this infighting, because it's probably going to nip you in the butt in the future. And you know, her internal client wasn't having any of that, and so she made him a deal. She says, let me kind of do some thinking about that and do some digging. And if it's actually hurting your business, then we could talk about what to do about it. But if it's just some relationship conflict, which he wasn't interested in at all, then let's sleeping dogs lie, and maybe this thing will work itself out. And he was like, okay, deal. And so she decided to poke at it. And what she learned was that the relationship between some of the parties on the leadership team was so bad that they gave a $50 million piece of business away to a competitor versus keeping it in house, because the person A did not want to give it to person B, who was also on the leadership team. So with that in hand, she was able to say, hey, Mr. X, it seems like it's actually a real business problem. Here's what's happening. The infighting and dysfunction is so bad that you're losing money. You just lost a $50 million contract, and you're probably going to miss your numbers for the quarter. Is this something you want to work on? So being able to do that, thinking ahead of time, and really getting your mind on what is the real issue and how to pitch it to this person in a way that would connect with what this person cared about, which was not relationships. He cared about revenue and making the quarterly numbers. She was able to frame it in a way that made him sit up and take notice. And they literally, that was on a Tuesday, they went to the offsite that weekend.
Oh, wow. So that's, well, but also the dollars that were attached to it. I mean, oftentimes if there's relationship issues, it will lead directly to business results, but people don't always um, connect the dots and
Right,
outline the line of sight and the effect and impact that
right.
those relationships are having on the business. In this case, she made it really explicit. So it's like, you can't say no to that and those kind of dollars.
Can't, but prior to that, Suze, I was coaching her,
Yeah.
right? Prior to that, she had initial conversation that went nowhere with him because she wasn't able to make that argument. And a lot of folks I've worked with kind of in our field, it's so obvious to her that they should tackle this because of all the logic that you're explaining right now.
Yeah.
And her initial thought was, you know, he's closed to learning, he's not into it, he doesn't get it, right? So she wasn't able to make progress with him in the first conversation. She's dismissive of his lack of interest in it. And I
Mhm.
helped her see, but what does this guy care about? Well, he cares about quarterly, the quarter, and making his numbers and the promise to Wall Street, and by the way, just pure revenue, right? And by the way, and it's like, well, none of how you're framing this is speaking into that. So why should he
Yeah.
be interested?
Yeah.
She didn't realize that before the conversation because for her it was so obvious that he should take this stuff seriously. And so then we crafted what the next series of conversations would be, and she went out and figured out what the real problem was able to pitch it to him that way. And one of the things I'm fond of saying with these conversations is pre-work or rework. If you can get your
Yeah.
mind, yeah,
Well, it sounds like really it got to the next level of detail, and also spoke in his language to
yeah,
his interests and concerns.
right, yeah. And these are kind of obvious things, but when people have conversations, again, I'm looking at a data sample of tens of thousands of documented conversations that didn't produce the results that people want. They're often really unaware of what it is about their own way of thinking about it and their own approach that may be part of the problem. And yeah,
Well, I was just going to say, right. In hindsight, it's easy for us to kind of dissect it and say, well, it seems so obvious. Why didn't she do that? But we all work in this web of relationships, and we all have our oftentimes unconscious biases. And so it was easy to
right,
kind of maybe write him off and say, oh, he just doesn't get it. He's just a numbers guy, and he doesn't get the people
right.
piece. And yet it sounds like you helped her understand how to translate that so he could understand the people piece and the impact on the business. But it's like we do get caught, like you're saying. And again, I know your work with the case studies that you can have people break it down and dissect it and see where they're unknowingly or maybe playing into their own, I want to say unconscious bias, but whatever it is
Sure.
that's getting in the way.
Yeah, I mean, largely people are doing the best they can in these conversations, and when they don't go well, they can't quite figure out why it is. And so in order to make this training really practical that we do for people, it's not enough for them to read something. They have to recognize how they're part of the problem, and that's the first step. And then you got to help them figure out, okay, what's really worth talking about, and how are they going to frame it up. But then it's really important how they handle the conversation and the interaction. And the basic people make two basic mistakes. They're either too comforting or too controlling, right? Or some entertaining passive aggressive combination of the two of those things. Um, Whereas what they need to be is a lot more courageous, and I think actually compassionate. It's almost the mental stance needs to be one of I think courageous compassion. And so what I mean by that is you really got to say what you mean, but you have to be as committed to creating the space for somebody else to say what they mean and to really listen and to empathize with what they're saying, because then that takes it out of a win-lose dynamic, or I'm right, you're wrong, or you're right, I'm wrong. But we are truly, honestly, candidly expressing ourselves to each other and helping each other do the same. Because what we care about is what's true, not who's right.
That
And
that's a pretty simple but profound statement that is the crux of what we're talking about here in terms of people developing the mindset and the skill to do it. Care about what is true versus being right.
yeah, and one of the guys who inspired me around that was one of my clients. he was the CEO of Red Bull North America, and he used to talk about, I want to create a culture where the best ideas win, regardless of who they come from. Not the person that's shouting the loudest, not the person that has the most power. It should be purely based upon, the quality of the idea, not the speaker. So I feel like a lot of my work is trying to equip and empower people with the skills to really effectively express themselves and to get into great candid conversations with other people so that the best thinking wins, regardless of where it comes from.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like we could, spend a lot more time on this. We've got like 2 more minutes, but
Okay.
I'm wondering in that time, if you could,
Go.
like, do you have one nugget? I understand it's a process and a transformational process for people,
Sure.
but do you have one nugget of insight or a tip? And I know it's not about techniques, but one thing for people to think about in trying to be more courageous?
Yeah, I think, there's a beautiful 3-step formula for expressing yourself more candidly and courageously in a way that's still very collaborative and compassionate. It's say what your point of view is, say what your reasoning behind that point of view is, and then step 3, ask people simply, what do you think about what I just said? So that you get the benefit of putting your views out there, but you're also signaling to other people that you actually want to have a conversation about it, that your mind isn't made up. And when people feel like you've got a point of view, but you're open to having that view challenged, then they tend to be much more open as well to considering your view and sharing with you what they honestly think. So here's what I think, here's why, what do you think? And
And so
that little
doing
recipe,
that,
I've got clients from 20 years ago who still are talking about that.
but in doing that, it
Yeah.
can't just be this process. They really have to have an open mind to be hearing what the other person thinks. And they have to be open to hearing their reaction to their point of view and their rationale.
And what that process also helps with, it almost forces an openness, because the moment you go, here's what I think, here's why, and you go, what do you think? You're like, oh, maybe there's a part of you that doesn't want to, but you're now exposed and you've
Yeah.
exposed your thinking to somebody else and they take you up on it.
Yeah.
And then you start hearing something that maybe is surprising you. And then it starts to expand your understanding of what's going on.
Yeah, Todd, we're at time. I'm
Wow,
so
that's
sorry.
fast.
I wish maybe we'll have to have you on again because there's a lot here. It's very rich. So if anybody was interested in anything we talked about, how would they reach you?
2 ways. They can email me directly. I got a team that monitors this particular email. So Todd@Holzman.com. So you can see my name on the screen, I think. Very simple. Or just go to my website, www.holzman.com.
All right. Thanks so much for coming on the show, Todd.
Oh, thanks for having me. That's great. Thank
Absolutely.
you.